My family took Christmas photos without me. I found out the way you find out about most quiet betrayals now, not through a phone call, not through someone sitting me down to explain, but through a photo posted online, 6 matching sweaters, a fireplace garland I'd helped my mother pick out the year before, and my absence sitting in the middle of the frame like a hole cut clean through the picture. Years later, when they asked me to join the family Christmas photo again, I smiled, wished them well, and spent the holiday with the people who had always made me feel like I belonged. This is the story of how I got from one moment to the other, from a girl staring at a photograph she wasn't in, to a woman who no longer needed to be in it to know exactly who she was. If you've ever loved a family that made you feel like a guest in your own life, stay with me. This one ends better than it starts. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 26 years, I thought belonging was something you had to keep earning. I don't think that anymore. But it took losing an entire holiday, and eventually an entire family, at least the version of it I'd been chasing, to learn the difference between being tolerated and being loved. I was the youngest of 3, born 9 years after my brother Daniel and 7 after my sister Margot, an arrival my mother once described, in front of company, as a lovely surprise, in a tone that made the word surprise sound like it was doing quite a lot of quiet, careful work. Growing up in the Whitfield house meant growing up inside a family that had already, in some essential way, finished forming before I got there. Daniel and Margot had years of shared history, inside jokes, childhood nicknames, a rhythm of sibling closeness built over nearly a decade before I ever entered the picture. I arrived into a story that already had its main characters cast, and no one, not out of cruelty exactly, but simply out of habit, ever quite made room to rewrite the script. My father, a quiet, hard-working man who ran a small hardware store in our town, loved us all, I believe, in his own limited, undemonstrative way. But love, in our house, was distributed less like an unconditional resource and more like a budget, carefully allocated, occasionally reduced, always subject to some invisible internal accounting I never fully understood the rules of. My mother, Diane, was the one who set the emotional temperature of our home, and the emotional temperature, where I was concerned, ran perpetually a few degrees cooler than it did for Daniel and Margot. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no obvious cruelty a stranger could point to and call unfair. It was smaller than that, and in some ways harder to name, the extra beat of hesitation before she hugged me, the way she remembered Margot's coffee order but always had to ask mine again, the particular, specific way she'd introduce me to new acquaintances as our youngest, a phrase that positioned me, subtly but unmistakably, as an addendum rather than a full member of the original cast. I spent most of my childhood and all of my adolescence trying to close that gap. I made honor roll every semester, hoping academic achievement might finally earn me the easy warmth Daniel and Margot seemed to receive simply by existing. I took up piano, then violin, then piano again, performing at every recital with the specific, exhausting hope that this time, my mother's applause might carry the same unguarded pride I watched her offer so freely to my siblings. I learned to read the room before I walked into it, adjusting myself in advance to whatever version of me seemed most likely, on any given day, to be welcome. It never quite worked. Not because I wasn't good enough, I understand that now, with the particular clarity that only distance provides, but because the gap was never actually about my performance at all. It was about a family that had, for reasons I would spend years trying to untangle, simply decided, early and quietly, that I was slightly less theirs than the other two. Every year, for as long as I could remember, the Whitfield family took a Christmas photo in front of the fireplace in our living room, matching sweaters, a professional photographer my mother hired every December without fail, a production that took the better part of an afternoon and produced, eventually, the single image that would appear on our holiday cards, sent out to what felt like half the county. I loved that tradition, or at least I loved the version of it that included me, back when I was young enough that my absence from the frame would have been unthinkable, impossible, simply not a category of thing that could happen. I have photos from every Christmas of my childhood, myself included, occasionally awkward, occasionally mid-blink, but there, undeniably present, part of the family unit the photograph existed to commemorate. The shift happened so gradually that I couldn't, even years later, pinpoint the exact moment it began. It started, I think, around the time I turned 22, the year I made the decision, a decision that would come to define the entire trajectory of my relationship with my family, to move 3 states away for a job in publishing, rather than staying local the way Daniel and Margot both had, both of them settling within a 20-minute drive of our parents' house, both of them folding neatly back into the family's existing geography. My mother took my decision to leave harder than I expected, though not in a way she ever articulated directly. Instead, the distance between us seemed to calcify into something structural, something built into the architecture of our relationship going forward, phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent, holiday visits that felt, increasingly, like something I had to specifically request rather than something automatically assumed. The first year I couldn't make it home for Christmas, genuinely couldn't, due to a work deadline that landed with brutal timing right in the final week of December. I assumed the family photo would simply happen without me, the way it sometimes had to when Daniel's wife's family claimed him for a holiday, or when Margot traveled. I assumed, when I finally did make it home the following year, that everything would simply resume as it always had. It did not resume as it always had. The Christmas after I moved away, I flew home for the holiday, landing 2 days before Christmas Eve, exhausted and jet-lagged but genuinely excited, in the specific, hopeful way you can only really feel about family when you've been away long enough to forget the harder parts and remember only the good. I arrived to find the house decorated exactly as it always was, the same garland my mother and I had picked out together the year before I'd moved, the same tree ornaments accumulated over decades, the same specific, familiar smell of cinnamon and pine that meant, to some deep and uncomplicated part of me, home. And on the mantelpiece, framed and already displayed, was this year's Christmas card, the professional photograph, matching sweaters, my parents and Daniel and his wife and their 2 kids and Margot and her fiancé, all arranged in front of the very fireplace I was now standing beside, smiling for a camera I had not been asked to smile for. I stood there for a long moment, coat still on, suitcase still in hand, staring at a framed photograph of a family that looked, on its surface, exactly like mine, except for the fact that I simply wasn't in it. "When did you take this?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, my mother passing through the living room with a tray of appetizers for guests who hadn't arrived yet. "Oh," she said, glancing at the photo with something that might have been mild discomfort, or might have simply been distraction. "Early December. We had the photographer booked, and honestly, we weren't sure exactly when your flight was landing, so we just went ahead." "I told you my flight date's in October," I said. I sent the confirmation. "Well, plans change so often with photographers," my mother said, already moving toward the kitchen. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, apparently concluded. "It's not a big deal, sweetheart. We'll get you in next year." I want to be honest about how small that moment felt in the room, and how enormous it felt inside me. From the outside, it was nothing, a scheduling miscommunication, a photographer's availability, a family that simply moved forward with a tradition rather than delaying it for one member's travel logistics. Reasonable, even, viewed at a certain angle. But I had sent the flight confirmation in October. I had specifically asked, in a family group text I still have saved, whether the photo would be scheduled around my visit. No one had answered that particular question. And standing there, in front of a mantelpiece displaying a family photograph that had been taken, deliberately, around a date they knew I would be present for and simply chose not to accommodate, I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down my spine, that this had not been an accident. I didn't say anything more about it that night. I put on a smile, helped my mother finish the appetizers, greeted guests, played my part in the holiday exactly as I always had. But something inside me, that had been slowly cooling for years already, finished cooling entirely in front of that fireplace. I want to tell you that I confronted my family immediately, that I demanded an explanation, that some dramatic, cathartic conversation happened that Christmas Eve that finally forced everyone to reckon with the pattern I was only beginning to fully see. That's not what happened. What actually happened was quieter, slower, and in its own way, more painful, a gradual accumulation of small moments over the following 2 years that, taken individually, could each be explained away, but taken together, painted a picture I could no longer avoid seeing. I noticed, that same Christmas, that Daniel's children had stockings hung on the mantel with their names embroidered in careful cursive, alongside stockings for Daniel and Margot and my parents, but that the stocking that had once been mine, the one I'd had since childhood, faded red felt with my name in gold thread, was nowhere visible, tucked away somewhere in a closet I didn't ask about. I noticed, at the following Thanksgiving, that my mother had made Margot's favorite pie and Daniel's favorite stuffing recipe, remembered without being asked, while my own long-standing request, a simple green bean dish I'd asked for every year since childhood, went unmentioned, until I brought it up myself, at which point my mother said, with visible surprise, "Oh, I didn't realize you still liked that." I noticed that family group photos from birthdays, from random Sunday dinners, from the small accumulated moments of ordinary family life that got posted online throughout the year, consistently featured Daniel and Margot and their families, while photos including me, on the rare occasions I was actually present for these gatherings, seemed to appear less often, cropped out, or simply never posted at all. None of it, individually, was a crime. All of it, together, over 2 years, began to form the unmistakable shape of a family that had, somewhere along the way, quietly decided I existed at the periphery of their actual life together, rather than at its center. I called my sister Margot about it, eventually, hoping, genuinely hoping, that she might see something I was missing, might offer some context that made all of this feel less deliberate. "I think you're reading into things," Margot said, not unkindly, but with the particular dismissiveness of someone who has never once had to wonder whether she belonged. "Mom's just busy. You live so far away now, it's harder to keep you in the loop on the small stuff." "It's not personal." "It feels personal," I said. "I think you're being a little sensitive," Margot said. "Nobody's trying to exclude you, Claire. You just aren't around as much. That's just logistics." I wanted to believe her. I wanted, desperately, for it to simply be logistics, distance, busy schedules, the ordinary friction of a family spread across different states. But logistics don't explain a Christmas photo deliberately scheduled around a date they knew I'd be home, and then not corrected the following year, or the year after that, when the exact same pattern repeated itself, twice more, with what began to feel less like oversight and more like a decision quietly, repeatedly renewed. The third Christmas after I'd moved away, I flew home again, having specifically, deliberately confirmed my travel dates with my mother nearly 4 months in advance, having sent, this time, not just a group text but a direct, individual message asking clearly, "When are you scheduling the family photo this year? I want to make sure I'm there." My mother responded, eventually, 3 days later, "We'll figure it out. Don't worry about it." I arrived home 2 days before Christmas Eve, again, and found, again, a framed photograph already displayed on the mantelpiece, the same matching sweaters, the same fireplace, Daniel and Margot and their families, my parents, and Nomi, taken, according to the date printed discreetly on the back, exactly 11 days before I'd landed. I stood in that living room for a long time, looking at that photograph, and I felt something inside me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but some third thing, some quiet, settling clarity that arrives only after you've asked the same question enough times and finally, fully accepted the answer you keep receiving. I found my mother in the kitchen, and this time, I didn't let the conversation slide past me the way I had twice before. I asked you directly, 4 months ago, when the photo would be scheduled, I said. I told you I wanted to be there. You told me not to worry about it. And now it's done, and I'm not in it, for the 3rd year in a row. My mother set down the dish towel she'd been holding, and for a moment, something in her face flickered, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, quickly smoothed back over into a more familiar, practiced patience. Claire, honestly, it's just a photo, she said. I don't understand why this keeps upsetting you so much. You've always been the sensitive one. It's not just a photo, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, some long-buried resolve finally surfacing after years of talking myself out of exactly this conversation. It's 3 years in a row. It's a pattern. It's you scheduling it specifically before I arrive, 3 times, after I specifically asked to be included. That's not an accident, Mom. That's a choice. I think you're making this into something it isn't, my mother said, her voice tightening now, the patience thinning. Daniel and Margot live nearby. It's simply easier to coordinate with them. You chose to move away. That comes with consequences, Claire. You can't expect everything to revolve around your schedule. I stood there, in the kitchen I'd grown up in, surrounded by the specific, familiar smell of Christmas that had once meant nothing but comfort to me, and I felt, for the first time, something close to complete clarity about what was actually happening in my family, and had, perhaps, been happening for a very long time. I didn't ask everything to revolve around my schedule, I said quietly. I asked to be in one photo. Once a year. With my own family. My mother didn't have an answer for that. She picked the dish towel back up, resumed drying a plate that was already dry, and the conversation, once again, was apparently over. I left 2 days after Christmas that year, earlier than I'd originally planned, citing a work obligation that wasn't entirely fabricated but wasn't, if I'm honest, the real reason I moved my flight up. The real reason was that I couldn't spend one more evening in that house, smiling for a family that had, quite literally, 3 times in a row, decided there wasn't room in the frame for me. I spent the flight home turning the entire situation over in my mind, trying to locate some explanation that didn't end in the conclusion I kept arriving at, over and over, no matter how many times I tried to talk myself out of it, that my family, or at least my mother, had made a quiet, ongoing decision to treat me as slightly less central to our shared story than Daniel and Margot, and that decision, whatever its original cause, had calcified over years into something close to permanent. I didn't make any dramatic announcements. I didn't send an angry email cutting ties, didn't stage some final confrontation. What I did, instead, was quieter and, I think now, considerably more important. I simply stopped performing the exhausting, endless work of trying to earn a place that apparently wasn't going to be freely given. I stopped calling as often. I stopped sending the specific, detailed updates about my life that I'd always hoped might finally generate genuine interest rather than polite, distracted acknowledgement. I let the distance between us, the literal, geographic distance that had apparently become such a convenient explanation for everything, simply exist, unchallenged, unmanaged, unfought. And in the space that opened up, unexpectedly, I found something I hadn't been looking for at all. I want to tell you about Nora Bianchi, my downstairs neighbor when I first moved into my apartment, 3 states away from everything I'd ever known, because she is, in many ways, where this story actually starts to turn. Nora was in her late 50s, a retired schoolteacher with a booming laugh and an open-door policy toward what she called her found family, a rotating cast of neighbors, former students, and assorted strays who found themselves, for one reason or another, without a place to be during the holidays. I met her during my first September in the building, when a plumbing issue in my apartment sent me knocking on her door asking if she knew a reliable plumber, and somehow, within 20 minutes, I'd been fed homemade lasagna and informed, with absolute confidence, that I was now on the list for Thanksgiving. The list for what? I'd asked. Thanksgiving, Nora said, as if this were obvious. You've got that look. The look of someone who doesn't have anywhere to go and is too proud to say so. I hadn't, at that point, told her anything about my family. I hadn't needed to. Nora had, apparently, a particular gift for recognizing people who were quietly, politely starving for exactly the kind of unguarded welcome she offered freely, without condition, to nearly everyone she met. That first Thanksgiving in Nora's apartment, crowded with mismatched chairs and too much food and a group of people who had nothing in common except Nora's insistence that they belonged there, I remember sitting at her table, watching her son Marcus argue affectionately with a former student named Priya about football, watching a young couple from the 3rd floor bicker good-naturedly over who'd made the better cranberry sauce, and feeling something I hadn't felt at my own family's table in longer than I wanted to admit, the specific, uncomplicated sensation of simply being wanted in the room, rather than merely tolerated in it. "You're quiet," Nora said to me, later that evening, finding me in her kitchen where I'd retreated to help with dishes I hadn't actually been asked to help with. "I'm just not used to this," I admitted. "Being somewhere where nobody seems to be silently ranking who matters most." Nora studied me for a long moment, drying a plate with more attention than the task strictly required. "Family you choose can be more honest than family you're born into," she said finally. "Not always. Sometimes birth family is exactly right, and you're lucky, and that's wonderful. But sometimes it isn't, and people spend years trying to force it to be something it was never going to become, when there's a whole world of people out there who would love them properly, if they'd just let themselves be loved by someone new." I didn't fully understand, that first Thanksgiving, how completely that conversation would end up reshaping the rest of my life. But I understood enough to keep showing up at Nora's door, year after year, as the holidays arrived and my own family's invitations grew increasingly, if never explicitly, conditional. Over the following 3 years, the found family Nora had first introduced me to slowly expanded into something I'd never fully had before, a genuine, chosen community that showed up for me not out of obligation, not out of the tangled, invisible accounting of birth order and old resentments, but simply because they wanted to. There was Priya, Nora's former student, who became one of my closest friends over long conversations in Nora's kitchen, and who, when I finally told her the full story of the Christmas photos, listened without once suggesting I was being sensitive, and instead simply said, "That's genuinely awful, Claire. I'm so sorry. That's not normal, and it's not your fault." There was Marcus, Nora's son, who I dated briefly and, when that didn't work out, remained close friends with anyway, in the specific, comfortable way that sometimes happens when 2 people genuinely like each other more than they were ever actually suited as partners. There was my coworker Jasmine, who I met during my 2nd year at the publishing house, who became something close to a sister in the specific ways my actual sister never quite managed, remembering my coffee order without being reminded, showing up unannounced with soup when I was sick, celebrating small professional wins with a genuine enthusiasm that never once felt rationed or comparative. And there was Theo, a graphic designer I met at a mutual friend's gallery opening 2 years after that third devastating Christmas, who would eventually become my husband, and who, on our very first date, listened to me describe, hesitantly, the strange emotional arithmetic of my birth family, and said, simply, "That sounds exhausting. You deserve people who don't make you keep proving you belong." I want to be honest that building this found family wasn't instant, wasn't some single magical Thanksgiving that fixed everything. It took years, small moments accumulated slowly, trust built gradually, the specific, patient work of learning, after a lifetime of conditional belonging, what it actually felt like to be loved without an invisible scoreboard running in the background. But by the time that third devastating Christmas photo happened, the one that finally, fully clarified what had been happening in my birth family for years, I had already, without fully realizing it, been quietly building an alternative. A table where I was never an afterthought. A family, chosen rather than given, that never once scheduled anything specifically to exclude me. The years that followed that third Christmas were quieter, in terms of my relationship with my parents and siblings, than any period since childhood. I still called on birthdays. I still sent cards at Christmas, still showed up for the occasional major family event, a nephew's graduation, my father's 60th birthday party, but I stopped chasing the deeper, warmer version of belonging I'd spent 20-some years trying to earn. My mother, over those years, occasionally acknowledged, in oblique, half-apologetic ways, that something had shifted between us. "You've gotten so distant," she said once, during a rare, longer phone call, her tone carrying more confusion than genuine self-examination. "I don't understand what changed." "I stopped trying to force something that wasn't there, Mom," I told her, as gently as I could manage. "That's what changed." "That's not fair," she said. "We've always loved you." "I believe that you love me," I said, and I meant it, in whatever complicated, imperfect way it was true. "I don't think you've always made me feel like I belonged." Those are different things, and I spent a long time not understanding that they were different, but I understand it now. She didn't have a response for that, not really, just a long silence on the line, followed by a change of subject, the way our hardest conversations always seemed to resolve, not through resolution but through quiet, mutual avoidance. I want to be honest that this period wasn't without grief. There were nights, especially around the holidays, where I ached for the family I'd wished I had, the version where my mother remembered my coffee order without being asked, where I appeared in every photograph without exception, where belonging didn't require constant, exhausting proof. I let myself grieve that, genuinely, rather than pretending the found family I'd built made the original loss painless. It didn't make it painless. It made it survivable, and eventually, slowly, it made it something closer to healed. Theo and I married 4 years after that third Christmas photo, in a small ceremony at Nora's favorite park, surrounded by the specific, chosen collection of people who had spent the previous years quietly, consistently proving to me what unconditional welcome actually felt like. My parents attended, along with Daniel and Margot and their families. I'd invited them, genuinely wanting them there, still holding, even after everything, some stubborn hope that our relationship might yet find its way towards something warmer. My mother cried during the ceremony, and for a moment, watching her, I let myself believe the tears meant something close to what I wanted them to mean. But at the reception, watching the seating arrangement I'd carefully planned, Nora and Priya and Marcus and Jasmine at the table of honor closest to Theo and me, a deliberate, symbolic choice I'd made without fully articulating, even to myself, exactly why it mattered so much. I understood something with a clarity that finally, fully released whatever remaining hope I'd been quietly holding on to. I had built this. Not my birth family. Me, and the people who had chosen, freely and repeatedly, over years, to make room for me. That table, full of people who had never once made me feel like an afterthought, was the truest photograph of my actual family that had ever existed, whether or not a professional photographer was ever hired to capture it. Theo and I built a life together over the following years, in the same city where I'd first moved for that publishing job, surrounded by the found family that had grown, slowly and organically, into something as solid and permanent as any family built by blood. We hosted our own Thanksgivings, in the tradition Nora had first taught me, an open table where anyone without somewhere else to be was simply, automatically welcome, no application process, no invisible scoreboard, no quiet accounting of who deserved a seat and who didn't. 7 years after that third devastating Christmas, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in early November, my mother's name on the screen, and something in the specific timing, early enough before the holidays to actually plan around it, made me answer with a small, cautious flicker of hope I hadn't quite expected to still be capable of feeling. "Claire," my mother said, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard from her in years, "I wanted to call you directly, well in advance this time, about Christmas. We're doing the family photo the week before Christmas Eve, and I wanted to make sure, really make sure, this time, that you and Theo could be there. I know things have been complicated. I'd really love for you to be in this year's photo." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a long moment, turning the invitation over, feeling the specific, complicated weight of finally, after 7 years, receiving exactly the thing I had once wanted more than almost anything else in the world. "That means a lot that you called to ask directly," I said, and I meant it, genuinely, without irony. "Can I think about it and call you back?" "Of course," my mother said, and I could hear, underneath the words, something that sounded almost like relief, as if she'd expected a harder no than the gentle uncertainty I'd actually offered. I hung up the phone and sat in my living room for a long time, Theo beside me on the couch, having heard my half of the conversation and watching me now with careful, patient attention. "What are you thinking?" he asked, not pushing, just present. "I don't know yet," I admitted. Part of me wants to say yes immediately. The part of me that's still, apparently, 22 years old, standing in front of that mantelpiece, wanting so badly to finally be in the picture. And the other part? I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it, turning over 7 years of quiet, hard-won peace, 7 years of Thanksgivings around Nora's crowded table, 7 years of never once wondering whether I belonged in the room I was standing in. The other part knows I already have a photograph I'm in every single year, I said slowly, the realization solidifying as I spoke it out loud for the first time. It's just not the one hanging on my mother's mantelpiece. I called my mother back 3 days later, having spent those days in careful, deliberate conversation with Theo, with Nora, with Priya and Jasmine, turning the decision over from every angle I could think of, wanting to be certain I was choosing from clarity rather than old, reflexive anger. "I've thought about it," I told my mother, my voice steady, carrying none of the old, desperate hope that had once colored every conversation like this one. "And I'm not going to make it this year. Theo and I already have plans for Christmas." "Oh," my mother said, and I could hear the specific surprise in her voice, the particular disbelief of someone who had, apparently, assumed the invitation itself would be enough to erase 7 years of accumulated absence. I really thought this was what you wanted." "It was, for a long time," I said, gently, without cruelty, but without softening the truth either. I spent years wanting exactly this call, Mom. I wanted it so badly it used to keep me up at night. But I don't need it the way I used to. I built a Christmas that doesn't require me to prove I deserve to be in the photo. I found people who never once made me wonder. There was a long silence on the line, and when my mother spoke again, her voice had changed, not defensive this time, but something closer to genuinely, painfully reflective. I know we made mistakes, she said quietly. I've known it for a while now, longer than I probably admitted to myself. I don't think I ever meant to make you feel like you didn't belong. I think I just got comfortable with a version of our family that already existed, and I didn't make enough room for how much you'd grown into your own person, someone I needed to actively choose to include, rather than just assume would always be there. I believe you, I said, and I did, genuinely. I believed that my mother had never set out, with cold, deliberate cruelty, to exclude me. I believed the exclusion had been thoughtless rather than malicious, born of old habits and unexamined comfort rather than genuine ill will. But belief in her intentions didn't undo 7 years of impact, and I had learned, slowly and at real cost, that intention and impact were not the same currency. Is there any chance, my mother asked, her voice smaller now, more uncertain than I'd heard it in years, that we could try again? Not this Christmas. I understand you have plans. But maybe, start smaller. A phone call, more regularly. A visit, sometime in the spring, when there's no photograph involved, no pressure. Just us, actually getting to know each other again, the people we've each become. I felt something loosen in my chest, hearing that, not the old desperate hope, but something calmer, more sustainable, the specific relief of an offer that finally asked something real of both of us, rather than simply expecting me to slot back into a role I'd long since outgrown. I'd like that, I said. Genuinely. But Mom, I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to prove I belong. If we do this, it has to be because you actually want to know me, the person I've actually become, not the daughter you remember from before I moved away. I'm not auditioning for a place in this family anymore. I already have a family. I'm open to you being part of a bigger version of it, if you're willing to actually show up for that. But I'm not going back to earning my place at a table that should have just been mine from the start. That's fair, my mother said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed her. I spent that Christmas, the one my mother had invited me to, the one I'd gently, deliberately declined, exactly where I'd spent the previous 7, at Nora's crowded table, now expanded to include Theo's family, a handful of newer faces who'd found their own way into our particular found family over the years, and the same core group who had, patiently and consistently, taught me what belonging without conditions actually felt like. The table was loud and mismatched and full of too much food, exactly as it always was, and at some point during the meal, Nora, now in her mid-60s, her booming laugh undiminished by time, raised her glass and said, with the specific, unguarded warmth that had first drawn me into her orbit years earlier, to everyone at this table. Every single one of you chose to be here. And every single one of you is wanted here, every year, no questions asked. I looked around that table, Theo beside me, Priya and Jasmine across from us, Marcus and his new wife near the end, Nora at the head, presiding over the whole loud, joyful chaos with the specific pride of a woman who had built, deliberately, over decades, exactly the kind of family she believed everyone deserved, and I felt something settle inside me, finally and completely, that 7 years of therapy and distance and slow, patient healing had been quietly building toward. I took a photo of that table, on my phone, without asking anyone to pose, without matching sweaters or a professional photographer or a fireplace garland selected months in advance, just the honest, unposed chaos of people who genuinely, unconditionally wanted to be exactly where they were. I still have that photo. It's the one I actually look at, now, when I think about what a family Christmas is supposed to look like. Not the framed portrait on my mother's mantelpiece, 6 matching sweaters and a hole cut clean through the middle where I used to be expected to stand. This one. Loud, unposed, and entirely, unmistakably mine. My relationship with my mother did, slowly, begin to change in the years that followed that phone call, not into something perfect, not into the warm, effortless closeness I'd once ached for as a younger woman standing in front of an empty space where her own photograph should have been, but into something more honest, more sustainable, built on smaller, more consistent gestures rather than grand, symbolic ones. We talk most weeks now, briefer conversations than I once wished for, but genuine ones, free of the old, invisible scoreboard. She visited Theo and me the following spring, exactly as she'd suggested, and we spent a weekend simply getting to know each other as the adults we'd each become, rather than as the roles we'd each been assigned decades earlier in a family narrative I'd finally stopped auditioning for. She's asked me, every year since, whether I'd like to be part of the Christmas photo, and every year, I've thanked her for asking and told her, gently but clearly, that I already have my Christmas. Some years, she seems to understand that completely. Other years, I can still hear the old confusion underneath her voice, the specific, generational difficulty of understanding that love, once withheld too many times, doesn't simply snap back into its original shape the moment it's finally, belatedly offered. I've made peace with that difficulty. I don't need her to fully understand it. I only need to know, for myself, that I'm no longer the girl standing in front of that mantelpiece, quietly absorbing the message that she wasn't quite central enough to warrant inclusion. That girl grew up. She built her own table. And she learned, slowly and at real cost, that the people who make you feel like you belong were never going to be found by trying harder to earn a place among people who'd already, quietly, decided you didn't quite fit. There's one more conversation I want to tell you about, one that happened almost by accident, nearly a year after that final Christmas invitation, because I think it says something important about how ripples move through a family long after the original stone has settled. My brother Daniel called me on a random Tuesday evening, not for any particular occasion, which was itself unusual enough that I answered with a small flicker of concern. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, and then, after a pause that told me he'd been building up to this call for a while, "I'd been thinking about something, and I wanted to actually say it to you instead of just thinking about it." "Okay," I said, waiting. "I never really noticed what was happening with the photos," he said. "Not really, not at the time. I was busy with my own kids, my own life, and it just seemed normal that Mom scheduled things around whoever was easiest to coordinate with. It wasn't until my daughter asked me, last year, why Aunt Claire was never in any of the old Christmas pictures, that I actually sat down and looked at them. All of them, going back years. And I saw it. The pattern. I saw exactly what you'd apparently been seeing for a long time, and I felt like a pretty lousy brother for never noticing sooner." I sat with that for a moment, feeling something complicated move through me, not quite forgiveness, not quite absolution, but something adjacent to both, the specific relief of finally being seen by someone who had, for years, simply not been looking. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "It means something that you looked. Most people never do." "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner," Daniel said. "I don't know if it would have changed anything. But I should have noticed. I should have asked, at least once, why you weren't there." "You're asking now," I said. "That counts for something." We talked for almost an hour that night, longer than we had in years, and by the end of it, something had shifted between us two, not a full repair, not an instant closeness to match what I'd built with Theo and Nora and the rest of my chosen family, but a genuine opening, a small, honest bridge where before there had only been the quiet, comfortable distance of a brother who'd simply never had reason to look closely enough to see me. I haven't mentioned, until now, that a significant part of this healing happened not just around Nora's crowded table, but in a small, unremarkable office 3 blocks from my apartment, in weekly sessions with a therapist named Dr. Wren, whom I started seeing about a year and a half after that third devastating Christmas. I want to include this part of the story because I think it's important, and because so many stories like mine skip past the unglamorous, unphotogenic work of actually processing this kind of pain in favor of the more satisfying beats, the found family, the wedding, the eventual phone call from a remorseful parent. That work matters. But it didn't happen on its own, and it didn't happen quickly, and I think anyone reading this deserves to know that the found family and the eventual clarity I found were built, in large part, on a foundation of unglamorous, weekly, sometimes tedious therapeutic work. You keep describing this as a photograph problem, Dr. Wren said to me, early in our work together, during a session where I'd once again found myself circling back to that mantelpiece, that framed image, the specific ache of my own absence from it. But I want to ask you something. If your mother had simply included you in every photo, exactly as you wanted, do you think the underlying dynamic, the coolness, the invisible ranking, the sense that you were always slightly less central than your siblings, would have actually been resolved? I sat with that question for a long time, turning it over with the particular discomfort of realizing a therapist has just, gently, dismantled the entire framework you'd built your grief around. No, I admitted finally. I don't think it would have been. The photo was never actually the problem. It was just the most visible symbol of the problem. If she'd fixed the photo and nothing else, I think I would have just found the next symbol, and the next, because the actual wound was never about a single missing picture. That's an important thing to understand, Dr. Wren said. Because it means the work you actually need to do isn't about getting your mother to finally include you correctly. It's about understanding your own worth independent of whether she ever does. The photograph is a symptom. Your healing has to happen at the level of the disease, not the symptom, or you'll spend the rest of your life chasing symbolic fixes that never actually touch the real wound underneath. That reframing took me most of a year to fully absorb, working through it slowly across dozens of sessions, unpacking not just the specific pattern of exclusion but the deeper, older belief it had planted in me, the belief that my worth was conditional, contingent, something I had to keep proving rather than something I simply, inherently possessed. I traced that belief back through years of honor roll certificates and recital performances and the specific, exhausting vigilance of a child trying to read a room before entering it, always calibrating, always adjusting, always performing the version of herself most likely to be welcome. You've spent your whole life auditioning, Dr. Wren observed, in one particularly difficult session, for a role that was never actually available to you, no matter how well you performed it. I think it's time to consider a different question. Not how do I finally earn my place in this family, but what does it look like to simply exist, fully and without apology, in a life of my own choosing, surrounded by people who never require an audition at all? That question became something close to a compass for me over the following years, the thing I returned to whenever old patterns threatened to resurface, whenever a new acquaintance's coolness triggered the familiar, exhausting instinct to perform harder, prove more, earn my way into rooms that should have simply been open to me from the start. Theo and I have a daughter now, Josephine, 6 years old, bright and curious and utterly unaware of the particular family history that shaped so much of the life she's growing up inside. I think about that history often, especially around the holidays, when Nora's table fills once again with mismatched chairs and too much food and Josephine runs between the adults she's grown up considering, without question, her family, Nora, Priya, Jasmine, Marcus and his wife, my brother Daniel and his family in recent years too, slowly, carefully folded back into the wider circle. Last Christmas, Josephine asked me a question that stopped me completely in my tracks, standing in Nora's kitchen with a serving spoon in my hand. "Mommy, why does Grandma Diane's Christmas picture look different from ours? There's not as many people in it." I knelt down to her level, considering how to answer honestly without burdening a 6-year-old with the full, complicated weight of the story. "Grandma Diane's family is smaller than ours," I said carefully. "Some families are big, with lots of different kinds of people in them, like ours. Some families are smaller, just a few people. Both kinds of families can be good families. They're just different shapes." "Is our family the good kind?" Josephine asked, with the specific, uncomplicated directness only small children seem to possess. "I think our family is exactly the right kind," I told her, and I meant it completely, without any of the old, complicated ache that question might once have triggered in me. "Because everyone in it chose to be here. Nobody in this family has to earn their place. You never will either. You're already exactly enough, just as you are, and you always will be." Josephine considered this with the particular seriousness small children bring to questions they don't fully understand yet but sense are important, and then, apparently satisfied, ran off to find Theo, leaving me alone in the kitchen for a moment with the specific, quiet pride of a woman who had built, deliberately and at real cost, exactly the kind of unconditional welcome she'd once spent decades trying to earn from people who were never going to freely offer it. I want my daughter to grow up never once wondering if she belongs in a room. I want her to never learn the specific, exhausting vigilance I spent my childhood mastering, the careful reading of emotional temperature, the constant recalibration, the quiet, endless performance of earning love that should have simply been given. I can't protect her from every hurt life might eventually hand her. But I can make sure that the table she grows up at, the family she considers home, never once requires her to audition for a place that was always, unconditionally hers. That, I think, more than the eventual phone call from my mother, more than my brother's belated apology, more than any single moment of vindication or closure, that is the actual ending to this story. Not that my birth family finally, belatedly tried to make room for me. But that I built, with my own hands and my own patient years of work, a family where the making room was never in question at all. If you're reading this, and you recognize yourself in my story, in the photograph you weren't in, the tradition that quietly moved forward without you, the family that loved you, probably, in whatever complicated way they were capable of, but never quite made you feel like you belonged, I want you to know something. You are not required to keep auditioning for a place that should have simply been yours from the beginning. You are not too sensitive for noticing a pattern that was, in fact, actually there. And you are not obligated to accept a life of conditional belonging simply because the people withholding it happen to share your blood. There is a whole world of people out there, friends who become family, neighbors who become anchors, partners who choose you fully and completely, who are entirely capable of making you feel, consistently and without conditions, exactly as wanted as you deserve to feel. Finding them takes time. It takes grief, sometimes, for the family you wished you'd had instead. But it is possible, and it is worth the patient, careful work of building. And if, like me, the door to your original family eventually opens again, offered more honestly than it was closed, you get to decide, on your own terms, whether and how to walk back through it. You don't owe anyone your return simply because they finally remembered to ask. You only owe yourself the clear-eyed choice of what actually, truly serves your own healing. I spent years wanting so badly to be in that photograph. I don't anymore. I found my own frame, filled it with people who never once made me wonder if I belonged, and I have never, not for a single Christmas since, looked back. If there's one image I'd want you to carry away from this story, let it not be the framed portrait on my mother's mantelpiece, 6 matching sweaters and a careful, deliberate absence where I used to stand. Let it be the other one, the unposed photo on my phone, Nora's crowded table, Theo's hand on my shoulder, Josephine's laughter somewhere just outside the frame, everyone in that picture there because they chose to be, year after year, without a single scheduling conflict ever quietly, deliberately arranged around my absence. That is what belonging actually looks like. Not a perfectly posed portrait. A table too full of people who love you to ever need a professional photographer to prove it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the family that makes you feel like a guest was never the whole story. Go find your table. See you in the next one.